Hello everyone, welcome to Module 3. In this module, we'll be talking about evidence-based instructional strategies, focusing on the area of reading. So your required readings for this week were Chapter 2, Chapter 5, and Chapter 6 of our textbook. Chapter 2 was going over foundations of effective instruction, and 5 and 6 went more into reading in general, so reading of word recognition in Chapter 5 and comprehension in Chapter 6. So in this module, we'll go over all of those a little bit more in depth. So we'll start off by talking about overall delivering effective instruction. So for the model for delivering effective instruction, teacher effectiveness is truly a function of two dimensions: learning that the student achieves, and then instructionally relevant behaviors that contribute to their learning. There is a direct correlation between the teacher efficiency and the student achievement. So the quantity and the quality of how that student is achieving based on the teacher and how efficient and effective their instruction is. And then there's also 3 dimensions of effective practice. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more throughout the module, where you're talking about all the activities that you're doing before instruction, during instruction, and after instruction to increase your effectiveness. On this slide, I just included figure 2.1 from our textbook. This shows the multiple dimensions of effective educational practices. So going through the management considerations, instructional practices, and then evaluative and collaborative activities. So it's just a good visual to talk about all those multiple dimensions. So talking about IEPs, or individualized education programs. So for all of your special education students that you work with in your career, you're going to have to deal with so many IEPs. So it's a good introduction in this chapter to talk about IEPs and all of their importance. So an IEP is a legal written document that talks about all the factors of a student's learning program. There were 2 major important laws that really impacted the development of IEPs. PL 94-142 in 1975, which reaffirmed the central role of the IEP as a guiding document to their educational program. And then the Andrew case, which we discussed in our last module for your assignment. So that just said that the IEP should be reasonably calculated to enable a child to make appropriate progress with whatever the circumstances were. So the IEP is the primary document, and it outlines a specific plan for services, placement, transitional planning, and other assurances. And it's really the driving force for instruction and an overall plan for the student. In addition to that, IEPs function as the basis for an evaluation, especially at the beginning of starting special education services. So the principal purposes of an IEP are to establish goals, to determine service that the schools must provide, and to enhance communication among parents and other professionals. So special education teachers will have to conduct further curriculum-related assessments to gather the type of instructionally useful data to establish the current and accurate levels of performance, to know where to begin instruction and where they're at a baseline, and then also develop appropriate goals. So yes, IEPs function as a basis for your evaluation, but teachers must have other curriculum-related assessments and different informal and formal type assessments in order to get that information. IEP should also provide an instructional direction that develops from that goal setting. Goals need to be measurable to provide a mechanism to determine the effectiveness of the instruction towards those goals. And then that improved communication is super important. IEPs really just help teachers, parents, and all support staff that deal with and support the student at all have that improved communication between and have more of a team approach when dealing with how to support a student's learning. So continuing that conversation of that team approach, this slide we're going to talk all about the IEP team. So the members of an IEP team can include parents and guardians of the student, the special education teacher, 1 or more general education teachers, a local education agency representative, or a person who has the authority to commit and give necessary resources, a person who can interpret the evaluation results. So in most cases, in my experience, someone like a school psychologist, the student when that's appropriate, other knowledgeable persons with whom parents or school may choose to invite, a transition service participant when applicable. So especially when students are at that transition age, a lot of times someone will come specifically for transition services. So all of these people come together to develop the IEP, and we're all working together to function in what the best interest of the child. Something really important to remember here is that parents are equal members of the team. So oftentimes I think that teachers go into IEP meetings and really just talk at parents and give them all of this information, but it really should be more of like a fluid document working together to talk about their child. And yes, you have information educationally that the parents don't have that you have to give them at these meetings, but having it be more of a collaborative conversation, giving parents a chance to give input, ask questions, be a part of the team in order to develop a plan that's really going to work for the student to make them the most effective student that they can be. Also, IDEA does require meaningful parent participation in IEPs. The IEP is a link between assessment and instruction. So at minimum, an IEP must be evaluated and rewritten annually as long as special services are still necessary or as long as the student is still found eligible. The IEP team may be convened more frequently due to things like special circumstances that may arise during the school year. I have personally had experiences where I wrote goals for a student, maybe who was new to me, and I had to write an IEP before getting to know them as well as I would have liked to. And then after getting to know them a little bit more, we've reconvened and wrote kind of a new, more detailed and accurate IEP for the student that gave a better representation once we got to know them better. I've also had experiences where I write goals for a student and they might meet all of the goals in less than that annual period. So rather than writing amendments for every goal over and over, we just come together and say, you know what, right now is a good time. Let's come up with a new plan, new goals, new present levels, all of these things together to really get a good idea of the student. Another time that you might convene outside of that annual time frame is if there are a lot of changes going on with the student. So if a student wasn't having a lot of behavioral concerns and started having some, and maybe you wanted to add services such as social work services or add different hours of service for an IEP, add different accommodations. All of those things can be done with an amendment, but oftentimes, in my experience, if you're going to amend many things on an IEP, rather than just doing an amendment and amending all these different areas, it's more effective to just hold a new IEP. So IDEA requires that the IEP contains performance statements. So that gives present levels of academic achievement. So in my district, we always call them PLAFs. So it's present level of academic achievement of all the different areas. So reading, writing, math, fine motor capabilities, health, social and emotional independent skills, all of the areas and what the student is able to do presently in these areas. And it's also important, again, to state what we're working on and what they can't quite do, but also give positive statements about what they can do in this present level. So it's not just a constant paragraph of all things that the student can't do, because especially as parents, nobody wants to read something like that. We want to hear strengths and weaknesses and kind of how we're going to combat those weaknesses. Also measurable annual goals. So that states what the child might reasonably achieve in a year. And goals have to be SMART, which we'll go into it a little bit more in a different slide about what SMART means. But always think for your annual goals, they need to be SMART goals. In addition to that, there's supplementary aids and services. So those are things like accommodations, adjustments, modifications, anything that the child might need to be successful. So that could be things like extended time on tests or preferential seating or visual supports. There's so many different things that can come in this area, and it's all individualized to what the student needs. Also, frequency, location, and duration of services. So again, you want to think about that continuum of services. On an IEP, you must state where that location of services will be held, how long, and how often they will occur. Often also the method by which parents will be informed of child's progress. So will parents be given progress reports 3 times a year at the trimester, quarterly at semesters? Will they be given them every month? So that's up to you and the team to decide how often parents will be given informed progress in a more formal way. And then if they're at age 16 or higher, also you need to have transition goals established in the IEP. And another thing I'd like to note here is in addition to those annual goals, there's also short-term objectives. So within every goal that you give a student, it's not one area that has to be broken down into different objectives, which can be like breaking the skill up into pieces or saying by 3 months out, they want them to make this much progress, 6 months out, this much progress, 9 months. It can be written in very different ways, but there also has to be short-term objectives within each annual goal. There are 4 different curriculum issues or areas talking about the instructional components of the IEP. So the first one is core curriculum. So that's like the Common Core state standards, access to general education curriculum, explicit instruction in ELA and math derived from the Common Core state standards, which are research and evidence-based, clear, understandable, and consistent among states, and then also aligned with college career expectations. They're based on rigorous content and also applying that within higher order thinking skills. So this core content area really seeks to ensure that students develop a common set of knowledge and skills during their school experiences. So someone who goes to school in one city and one state might have, yes, different schooling experiences, of course, but they'll have some consistency and a common set of knowledge that they will come away from school with. Also, it's provisions for assuring that special ed supports when you're included in general education are there and are appropriate, and then also meaningful access to curriculum and enhancing their skills and their knowledge that they are learning. The next area is functionality. So functionality is preparing students for those independent living skills, making sure that they are learning positive skills to have a positive quality of life, and infusing this curriculum together. So functional curriculum is one focused on adult life outcomes and includes that skills that students need to learn in order to be independent and have those positive life skills and quality of life later in life. So the emphasis is on preparing students for living and working and living in an inclusive community. And relating life skills to academic curriculum can be achieved by infusing life skills into academics, which is where that infusing curriculum comes in. So you're augmenting an academic curriculum with functional content and providing differentiated coursework to really infuse them and put them together. So you're working together to embed life skills into academic instruction and vice versa. If an educator is able to augment provision of a life skill or academic curriculum, then they're devoting a portion of their class period to teaching content and to teaching these special skills. So infusing it together really is an important way to get that differentiated coursework and to get that get those skills that those students need in order to get those independent skills that might not be taught in an everyday curriculum for all students. Next is comprehensive curriculum. So a comprehensive curriculum caters to students' current needs and also prepares them for life after school. So this is how students will fare once they exit the program. So what was taught and learned and how that affects their adult functioning and outcomes. So some central attributes to this comprehensive curriculum are they need to respond to the needs of the individuals at the current time. They need to accommodate needs so that students can access general education curriculum in meaningful and effective ways. And I think that's a really important point there too. It's not just giving them access to the content and to the curriculum and letting them sit in a class that is teaching it. It's giving them access in really meaningful ways that is getting through to the students. Also attending to the crucial needs that are absent from general education curriculum. So again, some of those academic and life skill oriented infused curriculum like we were talking about in functionality. Some of those things are things that need to be directly taught for our students with special needs, but aren't necessarily part of a curriculum and aren't taught in a general education classroom. So we have to attend to those needs as well. Also developing curriculum from a realistic thoughts of the potential adult outcomes. We have to be realistic. We can't tell every single student that they're going to be able to do all these crazy, crazy things. Obviously, we want to have them have goals and set goals high, but we also need to keep them in a realistic framework in order to make those goals and transition plans effective and also relevant and things that they can achieve. Also ensuring consistency with their transitional needs, and then remaining sensitive to graduation goals and specific diploma track requirements. So depending on what their diploma track is, that does involve different requirements. So having to be sensitive to what those are. So really this comprehensive curriculum is very outcome oriented and really thinks a lot about that transition. The last part we'll talk about are the 3 different types of curriculum. So the first is explicit. So it's formal, stated curriculum. Intended curriculum is another word for it. It may be referred to as overt, written curriculum that can be found in things like state standards. They're across grade levels. They articulate a state's content and performance standards. They have increased attention to and pressure of the standards and the school standards. Next, there's hidden curriculum. Which is taught curriculum or implicit curriculum. It's what students are exposed to on a daily basis, the actual curriculum that's implemented in the classroom. So this includes content coverage that's supplemental to the explicit instruction in curriculum. It includes interpretations of the explicit curriculum related to the implementation procedures and emphasis on different aspects of the curriculum. Also includes insertion of content that the teacher chooses to cover, either by necessity, based on student needs, or based on other preferences and other individual needs. And then also teachers having to teach skills that they were not expecting to teach. So when you look at your Common Core state standards for the year, even in a special education classroom, you're not told that you need to teach those functional life skills. So you have to find times to get those into your curriculum and into your everyday, in addition to trying to get your students access to that general education curriculum and also overall their functionality curriculum, comprehensive, all of those things. And then also there's absent curriculum or null curriculum that is not taught. So this is content that is just not covered. So certain content's just not part of explicit curriculum, and other times it's a choice made by the teachers. When talking about effective instructional practices, we want to make sure that we are talking about things that are consistent with IDEA, and that are research-based and empirically validated. So these include things like culturally and linguistically responsive instruction, explicit instruction, instructional grouping, scaffolding, student-directed or self-regulated learning, problem-based learning, and peer-mediated instruction, which we will go into on each slide. Culturally and linguistically responsive instruction. So this is the first area that we discussed on the last slide. So this is instruction that teaches to the student to the strengths of each student while validating and affirming their cultures. So this needs to recognize the student's prior knowledge, recognize their skills and experiences that they have had in their life, connect meaning from that prior knowledge, skills, and experiences to new classroom materials and activities, use a wide variety of instructional techniques that account for all types of learning needs, preferences, communication styles. Also needs to teach students to understand and appreciate their own culture as well as other cultures, and incorporate multicultural knowledge, resources, and materials in all subjects. So some big things here are that openness, sensitivity, responsiveness to the needs and backgrounds of all of your students. The next area is explicit instruction. So explicit instruction is essentially a synonym for direct instruction. So it refers to this broad set of educational programs incorporating elements of systematic and explicit instruction. So it provides supports needed to aid our learning. This explains the skill, models the skill, practices the skill, and gives feedback on the skill performance. So those are all the different things that explicit instruction has to do. Some characteristics of explicit instruction are that it must optimize engaged time and time on task. It has to segment complex skills into smaller steps, have skills sequenced logically, organize lessons to intentionally focus attention through modeling on important content, promote active engagement, provide prompts and supports for problems, and then fading those prompts as appropriate, providing frequent opportunities for responding and receiving corrective feedback, providing practice opportunities to assist in acquisition learning through guided practice, and then proficiency and retention through independent practice, helping students maintain high attention and response, having instructional sessions scheduled frequently and consistently, providing a sufficient amount of time for instruction, using progress pacing, providing frequent question-answer interactions, and incorporating instructional activities that require a response. So whoosh, there's so many different things and so many different characteristics of explicit instruction. It's so much more than just, oh, you have to teach them explicitly. There are so many different avenues that you have to think about. One instructional approach that's a very systematic instructional approach where they apply the principle of explicit instruction, it's referred to as PURPOSE. So it's an acronym. PURPOSE stands for prepare the student to learn, understand the skill steps, rehearse the skill, perform a skill check or kind of a formative assessment, overcome the performance barrier, select a situation where the skill can be performed, and then evaluate the skill performance. So that's an important approach to think about in that area of explicit instruction, and we call it PURPOSE. Next is instructional grouping. So simply stated, this is how students are grouped for their instruction, but you want to consider all the things that are important to consider for planning and instructional purposes and how that process will look. So this is the most frequently reported structure for things like reading instruction, for example, in special ed and general education, remains whole group instruction. But there's a huge benefit in the use of skill-based grouping for students with special needs and thinking about those small groups and really, really getting in on those smaller instructional groups rather than teaching to a whole group, and especially with special education, because in your classroom you could have so many different needs and so many different abilities. So being able to use small group to really individualize it more is so important. For example, like in my classroom, I have a whole group lesson for reading that is like a 10-minute lesson, and then we spend over an hour in small groups or individual groups with my students going through very, very intensive interventions and instruction in the area of reading and literacy. So I could not imagine, especially with a class in my position teaching an autism-based center, but then also in my previous experiences teaching in a self-contained cross-categorical program, I could not imagine only teaching a whole group lesson. So I think that's something that we really need to get on as a overall focus, is that whole group is not always the best. We really need to find ways to group these kids to make it more individualized and more effective for them. And then grouping can be based on needs, ability, and interests. So for special needs, there's a large benefit that research shows of skill-based grouping, but it can be based on all of these different areas. Next up is scaffolding. So important. Scaffolding means the temporary assistance that's provided by teachers to support students and help them with their learning process. So this really is like a custom-made support for the construction of new skills. So teachers model a learning-related process by thinking aloud or talking through the steps that they follow to reach a conclusion. So they're really modeling it. They're telling the students exactly how they're going through it and thinking about it in order to get to an answer. As the students begin to understand, then they gradually take over more ownership of the learning. They take over through procedure. The teacher acts as more of a coach, only providing prompts when needed. And then eventually the student is able to be more independent with the process. So the strategy leads students into being active participants in the reading process, and when it's used effectively, student responds to lower and higher level questions, and they're likely to improve and show so much more progress within this model. Student directed or self regulated learning. This is really talking about how we want students to take ownership and become independent learners. A major goal of education is to develop students so that they become independent individuals, learners, all of the things that they can do things on their own. They're able to direct their own behaviors in ways that assist in maximizing the amount of time engaged in learning and display appropriate behaviors and prepare them for their futures. So teachers need to assist students in becoming independent learners and to be in control of their behaviors. So you need to structure your classroom environment in ways that assist students to be able to develop self-regulation strategies. One of the biggest things that I talk about, especially with my paraprofessionals in my classroom, is the importance of independence for my students. So again, I have 5 pretty pretty severe students with autism in my classroom, and one of the biggest things that I tell them all the time when they're trying to do everything for the student is, what is that teaching them? So my students are in 5th and 6th grade. Most of them should have no problem being able to unpack their backpack in the morning, go to their locker, unpack their things, bring them into the classroom, put their lunchbox where it needs to go, all of these things. However, if you're going to do it for them, then they're going to take full advantage of that and allow you to do that for them. But then what is that teaching them? It's teaching them that they can act as if they don't want to do this or can't do this, and then you're just going to do it for them rather than help them find these different ways in order to do it themselves. So it's something that I have to tell them so often. But it's such an important part of a student's future, and really teaching students is thinking about those independent skills. And that's the question I always ask is, what is that teaching them? So this figure, I think, is a great figure, the self-regulation with the 4 different areas that talk about this. So the 4 subcomponents of this self-regulation or student-directed learning are self-monitoring, which means skills associated with monitoring your own behavior, self-instruction, which are skills associated with taking oneself through a task using overt and covert verbalizations. Self-evaluation, which are skills associated with the ability to analyze one's performance and make corrections. And then self-reinforcement, which are skills associated with rewarding yourself for correct behavior or successfully accomplishing a task. I always think of problem-based learning as the students are becoming investigators. They're really trying to figure out the real problem or topic, and they go through a series of stages in order to do so. So the stages are, first, the students are guided to explore many topics. Then they choose a topic. Then they develop a project management plan. And then they show a process of independent or small group study to help them evaluate what they've accomplished. This can be used in content areas, and it's a really good way to use those other higher level thinking skills and just different skills than you'll use in your academic everyday type of classroom assignments with this project-based or problem-based learning. Next is peer-mediated instruction. So students benefit not only from being able to direct their own learning, but also from knowing how to work with others in joint talks or how to seek assistance from others when they need it. So these are instructional practices that involve students working interdependently to achieve a goal. So a few things that this can include. One is peer tutoring, which is pairing a more skilled student with a student who might be less proficient in a particular behavioral or academic area. There's tons and tons of advantages to this that we talked about in the book, but I'm not going to go through all of them. But there are just tons of advantages for this peer tutoring. And it really helps both sets of students in the group. The next is peer-assisted learning strategies, or PALS. So this assists in learning through paired instruction. So each member of the pair takes a turn serving as the coach and serving as the reader. So first, your coach is being a reader at a higher achievement level who might listen to, comment, reinforce the other student, and then roles are reversed. The next would be class-wide peer tutoring. So the teacher's role changes from the primary deliverer of instruction to a facilitator and monitoring of peer teaching activities. Another is cooperative learning, which enlists support of students while simultaneously providing learning of academic and behavioral skills. So this promotes positive interactions among diverse backgrounds. So things like positive interdependence, individual accountability, collaborative skills, and problem-solving processes are all huge advantages and elements of this. And one big example that is being used a lot in classrooms right now is that think, pair, share. So that's an example of a peer-mediated instruction technique. Some instructional dimensions or features that are important for effective teaching of students with special needs include a lot of the things that we talk about in this module for the IEP, but things like individual planning, specialized instruction, explicit instruction, goal-directed programs, and then monitoring the instruction and learning. Technology is obviously a huge part of our day-to-day life now, and there are so many different ways that we can use technology to support our learners. So I think this is a really important part to really hone in on and talk about, but then also to read about, to do research about, which is why one of your assignments is in assistive technology for this module. So the revolution in technology for persons with disabilities got significant support with technology-related assistance in the Individuals with Disabilities Act. So instructional technology is any use of hardware, software that assists teachers in planning, delivery, or evaluation of instruction. Some examples of this are software to generate instructional materials, techniques for polling students during instruction, systems for collecting, charting, and interpreting data on progress of students, etc. Assistive technology is a really important vehicle for instruction and complementary source of adaptations for our learners. So there's devices and services. There's two main parts. So an AT device refers to any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially, off the shelf, modified, or customized, that's used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of a child with a disability. So that's a device. Then we have AT service. So service is a service that directly assists the individual in the selection, acquisition, or use of their device. The potential outcomes of effective assistive technology use are things like success in meeting the demands of their educational programs, daily life challenges being overcome, helping them overcome barriers impacting inclusion and independence, providing compensation for functional limitations, and fostering appropriate social interactions. There are so many advantages and outcomes of using technology and using it appropriately. The invention and really huge step in the right direction for this use of assistive technology was the iPad or similar technology, things like tablets, because it opened a range of inexpensive, relatively inexpensive options for so many students. So there are numerous devices that enable people with challenges to access computers and different devices. So when thinking about AT devices, you want to think about this acronym of TAPE. They want to be transportable, so you can take them from place to place, available all the time, so it's not something that you have to order and it's going to take 45 years to come in, practical, and engaging. There's also a range and a lot of options when it comes to assistive technology. So I think oftentimes when you hear the term assistive technology, you're thinking only of these high-tech options. So things like iPads, different tablets, computers, communication devices, all of those things. But there's a different range. There's low tech or no tech. Some people call it no tech, mid tech, and then high tech. So low tech starts, this has to be without power and it requires less training to be used by students effectively. Mid tech generally works on a battery power. The cost is presumed lower and the need for training is less for effective use by students. And then high tech is sophisticated technology or apps and software for those technology devices. So examples are voice synthesizers, print reading software, computers, tablets, mobile devices, text-to-speech, virtual manipulatives, many, many things there. This is just a great visual to show different examples of assistive technology at all 3 of these levels, but I'm not going to go in depth and talk about all of those examples. It's just a good visual for you to have. So, chapter 2 was an overview of evidence-based practices and using them in your instruction. So, it had a lot of information, so we went pretty thoroughly through that chapter. The next 2 chapters are talking more about how to do that in just a reading. So, first with word recognition and then with comprehension. So, I'm going to go over these chapters a little bit more quickly, but all of the slides, which are a great resource for kind of summaries of the different areas of the chapters, will be available and already are available on Canvas. So you can use those to help guide your learning, but I'm not going to go over every single slide, just to focus on time and really the most important things from both chapters. We know that reading is obviously extremely important. It's very essential for living in today's world. So personal independence requires at least functional literacy. Failure to read restricts academic progress because proficiency in math, English, science, social studies, all of these things depend in part on a student's abilities to read. So teachers should seek ways to integrate reading instruction into all other areas of their curriculum whenever possible. However, this also means that for your learners with special needs, you have to have accommodations in place for those students in the other areas when reading is required in order to complete an assignment in a different academic area. So there are 2 main features of reading. First is word recognition and decoding the code-based skills, things like phonic, phonemic awareness, and automatic word recognition. Then there's meaning-based skills, which are oral language, vocabulary, and comprehension. When you tie those 2 areas and features together, it leads to successful reading and reading comprehension. Quickly just summarizing and reiterating the information that when assessing reading, you need data from multiple sources to give an overall picture of a student's strengths and weaknesses. So assessments have to be informal, more classroom-based, and formal. So, when discussing instruction in the area of word recognition, many things are similar to what we discussed in chapter 2. So, discussing this really important aspect of having explicit and direct instruction. So, that explicit instruction where the teacher is directly responsible for the instructional activities and the student is highly engaged, it's systematic, it's sequential. Students' responses and feedback are monitored. They're followed with corrective feedback, use prompts, and fade them as needed. And then also that direct instruction for teaching reading skills. For our students with disabilities, the need increases for more intensive and extensive interventions that might not otherwise be provided. So things like longer periods of time for instruction, limiting the group size, focusing more directly on the student learning needs more individually, supplementing reading instruction with after school or summer programs, and continuing intensive instruction at the high school level and within their entire education. Phonemic awareness is the ability to recognize individual phonemes in spoken language and things like identifying sounds, syllables, and sound structures of words. So, really, the ability to manipulate sounds, identify sounds. So, phonemes are the smallest linguistic unit to carry meaning. So, it's words that you can pronounce. There are 44 phonemes in the English language, categorized into vowels and consonants, and then consonants are categorized into voiced, voiceless, oral, nasal, pace, and manner of articulation. Our instructional guidelines here are very similar, again, to what we talked about in previous chapters. Phonetic analysis, it builds on phonemic awareness as students learn how to apply their knowledge of phonology to the written word. So it provides a strategy to attack unknown words by applying rules that they have learned in order to decode sounds. So to do this in a systematic and direct way, teachers will explicitly teach students to relate sounds and letters blend sounds into words, break words into sounds. This helps students understand the relationship between sounds and letters, promote the application of phonics skills as they're reading, and stress alphabetic knowledge, phonemic awareness, vocabulary development, and text reading along with this phonetic analysis instruction. Sight words are a whole word approach, so students learn to recognize important, high frequency words without analyzing them. So, with automaticity, they want to be able to immediately know that word when they're reading it and not try to sound it out and guess what word it is. Fluent readers have to use sight vocabulary consistently and apply phonetic analysis only to new words or words they have to decode. There are many different strategies to teaching sight words in this chapter and out in the teacher world and in the universe out there. There are so many different great strategies for teaching sight words. So I'm not going to go over them all right here, but again, many in your textbook that are great resources to look at. Fluency is the ability to read text accurately, quickly, and with expression. So, fluency in reading serves as a bridge between word recognition and comprehension. As students are able to more fluently read sentences and passages, they should be able to follow the text meaning as well. The goal is to be able to devote less effort to word access on the given page, and therefore they can flow into a better understanding of the content that they are actually reading. So, the three main elements of fluency are speed, accurate word recognition, and expressive reading. This chapter went over 5 different strategies for teaching fluency, so we're going to go over those. The first is repeated reading. So, this means that you read selected passages multiple times. The purpose of this is to seek to develop automaticity in word recognition and positively affect the fluency and comprehension. So you want to select a passage about 50 to 200 words, read it at a comfortable pace at least 3 times, and then the student continues to read the passage until a satisfactory level of fluency is reached. They can be really positively influenced for students' learning and their overall reading development, and teacher guidance is a really critical component and results in more significant gains in fluency and reading comprehension within this model. Unison reading means that the teacher and student read a text together. So the instructor sits behind the student and reads slightly faster and louder, pointing to the words as they read. This is something that can be done 5 to 10 minutes daily, but this is a strategy that should be terminated if no improvement is noted in a reasonable period of time. If it's going to be an effective strategy for your students, you should see progress quickly. So if you are not, terminate the intervention and find a new one to use. Next is paired reading. So this means 2 students who have similar instructional reading levels will read aloud in unison or independently with support from their partner. So the material should be familiar and interesting to both of the students. One can assist when the other hesitates or make an error, but they need to allow at least 4 seconds for self-correction before they intervene. And this allows for positive reinforcement, discussion, and self-correction between the pairs. Next is oral reading. So the main purpose of this is diagnosis, conveying of directions or instruction, personal pleasure, articulation and vocabulary practice, memory reinforcement, rereading for better comprehension, and group participation. This helps in the development of correct word pronunciation, enunciation, and intonation. So oral reading gives teachers insight into beginning readers' knowledge of sight words and decoding skills. There's a big advantage for using these for beginning readers, and it's used heavily in the early and elementary grades. And the last is silent reading. So students may need guidance for silent reading, and they need to be able to practice and transition from that oral reading to silent reading. It's a critical skill to develop, but especially our students with special needs need help in there from their teachers in order to get from that transition from oral to silent reading. Our next chapter focuses on reading comprehension. The goal of reading comprehension is to obtain meaning from the printed material that a student is reading. It's the most critical skill for students to get in order to be successful in school. So there's two main components, word knowledge and text comprehension. So word knowledge means that you understand what the words and word variations mean. And then text comprehension means you can make sense of all of that information when you put it all together. There are 3 levels of reading comprehension skills. So oftentimes, especially with our students with special needs, literal is the only or most used type of reading comprehension skill that we're practicing, and we really need to make sure that we are pushing our students to be able to get levels of reading comprehension skills on all 3 of these levels. So literal is information as printed. It's right in the text. You can find it by looking back into your book. Inferential comprehension means that they have to move beyond the literal information and infer meaning based on what they read. And then critical comprehension means that the reader needs to be able to analyze and evaluate the information they read to develop a new perspective on the content. There are 2 types of text structure, so narrative, more storytelling, in fiction, legends, stories, things like that, and then expository, which relates to material that's factual, nonfiction material, textbooks, biographies, newspapers, magazines, those things. There are also 3 phases of reading comprehension where we have to do before reading to establish the purpose, during reading to monitor the reading, and then after to reflect. Building vocabulary is a really important part of reading and reading comprehension that often isn't talked about as much. So we're going to go over that here. Vocabulary knowledge includes oral and reading vocabulary. Much of what happens in the classroom on a daily basis, things they're all associated with the ability to acquire the vocabulary and understand it. So, students must learn a substantial number of words every year in order to be successful in academic programs across subject areas. And it's also extremely important for students in terms of their impact on reading comprehension in general, and then also performance on assessments in more of a high stakes situation like district and statewide assessments. There are 3 types of words. So we have critical words, which are essential and crucial to the understanding of the text. Academic words, which are seen across content areas and reflect vocabulary that speaks to a specific process, such as the ability to summarize, compare and contrast, construct, or describe and discuss. And then we also have challenging vocabulary, which is otherwise difficult to understand within any context. So things like idiomatic expressions. Another important information that I read in this chapter that I thought was really important was that students may need 12 or more exposures to a word in order to be able to fully understand it as well as recognize it in the future when they are reading. So it's important to provide students with consistent exposure to the basic vocabulary and provide for a lot of repetition. And then again, there are a lot of important instructional guides here and talking about how to use that instruction, like modeling, guided practice, maintenance, generalization, all of those things that you can read about more in depth in the chapter, and then also continuing with what we talked about in chapter 2. These specific vocabulary strategies here are super important. Things like graphic organizers, repeated or multiple oral readings, like repeated readings we talked about earlier, mnemonics, and text relevance. So all of these are specific strategies to really hone in on that vocabulary and are extremely important for students' overall reading abilities. A key focus of instruction for students with special needs is the provision of a systematic and explicit instruction on skills and strategies to allow the students to better engage in textual material and really giving them opportunities to engage and access the curriculum. So the teacher's task is to ensure that there's appropriate attention given to all the different levels of comprehension based on the learning needs of individual students. So we have to talk about all 3 of those levels, literal, inferential, and critical, questions within the same lessons, and then we also want to use these 8 evidence-based successful instructional techniques. So in the following slides, they go over more of these techniques in more depth, as well as in the textbook, but we're not going to go over them for sake of time all together in the lecture. So these are question answering, question generation and comprehension monitoring, graphic and semantic organizers, story structure, peer mediated strategies, summarization, explicit and systematic instruction, and then multiple strategy teaching.